Police officers of Reddit, what is the scariest/creepiest thing to happen to you on the job? I'm a dispatcher, and I'll never forget this call. A woman called 911, but she was whispering so softly, it was almost impossible to hear her. I could barely make out any words, but I managed to get an address from her. I stayed on the line, hoping for any more information until the officers arrived. When they got to the house, a man came outside. They asked him about the 911 call, and he claimed it was just an accidental dial, that there was no emergency. But something about his response didn't sit right with them, so they stayed nearby, talking with him. Then, one of the officers noticed something odd, a small hand waving from a tiny window. They rushed inside and found a woman who had been badly beaten and was being held against her will. The man was arrested on charges of forcible confinement. To this day, that moment still gives me chills. Dispatch sent us to a residence for reports of a man discharging a shotgun inside his home. When we arrived, his mother ran out screaming, "He's in his room." I had her wait by my patrol car while my partner and I made entry. I took point as we cleared the house. The hallway to his bedroom felt endless. When I turned the corner, there he was, sitting calmly in a chair with a shotgun across his lap. We recognized each other from a previous arrest. "Hey, officer," he said, like we were meeting for coffee. I kept my voice steady, trying to de-escalate as I slowly moved forward. For a moment, I thought maybe we could talk him down. Then he gave me this sad smile and said, "Doesn't matter. Thanks for trying, though." Before I could react, he raised a shotgun. The image, the sound, it stays with you. I still hear his voice sometimes when it's quiet. But I've learned to carry it with help from counseling and my family support. I still put on the uniform every day. Because for every call that shakes you, there are others where you actually get there in time. A man overdosed on heroin while reaching for something from his bedside table. As he collapsed, his head fell into the top drawer, and he ended up choking to death, unable to move. The best he could do was vaguely hug the drawer. The next morning, his mother found him, dragged him off the drawer, and laid him on the floor before calling emergency services. He was left exactly as he had died. When we arrived, his body was lying on his back, with his limbs sticking up in an awkward position, like a bug on its back, almost in a crawling pose. His face and neck were swollen and red, but there was a striking white line around his throat where the drawer had pressed against him, making it look as if his throat had been slashed. At first glance, it wasn't terrifying, just strange, something you don't expect to see at 7 a.m. What I'll never forget is the sound of the undertakers working to straighten his stiffened limbs, each joint creaking as they handled his rigor mortis body. I'm a former EMT, not a cop, and I work the night shift. This happened either the night before or the night of Halloween. We got a call to a remote location for generalized pain, which immediately raised a red flag. For us, that could mean anything from "I hurt my finger" to "I've been shot and I'm dying, but I don't want the cops involved." And of course, we get this call around 3 a.m. When we arrive, it's an eerie old lady who directs us to enter through the garage. Why? Because she's got a TV blocking the front door to protect herself from zombies or some kind of robbers. Strange, right? Well, the garage is pitch black. We ask her to turn on the light, but she refuses, saying squirrels chewed up the wires. My partner and I exchange a weird look, but didn't think much of it, assuming it was just some weird Halloween vibe. We head inside, and there's a single mattress on the floor. No furniture, just the TV blocking the front door. The patient is her daughter, who has chronic pain. Nothing too serious. We get her to the ambulance, but something felt off about the crazy old lady. I decided to close the truck door, leaving my partner and the patient inside. My partner was bigger than me and could handle both the patient and the stretcher, so I stayed outside. That's when things took a strange turn. The old lady, now with her arm in a sling, was standing outside, trying to hand me a Diet Coke for her daughter. I refused, and that set her off. She threw the can at me, then charged toward the house. But just a few feet away, she suddenly turned around and came straight for me again. This time, I noticed something in her hand, a knife. At that exact moment, my partner opened the truck door, which startled the lady enough for me to make a quick decision. I jumped in the truck and we sped off to the hospital. When I got home, I broke down in tears. That was the first time I nearly died on the job, and it just so happened to be at 3 a.m. on Halloween. One time, I was chasing a burglary suspect, and he ran into a farmer's market that doubled as a homeless camp. I knelt down to search for him, and of course, planted my knee right in a pile of human feces. It soaked through my pants. Once we finally caught the guy, I rushed back to the station and tried to clean up as best as I could with antibacterial soap. But no matter how much I scrubbed, well, it wasn't enough. The call came in about an older woman whose husband hadn't returned for lunch after going out to cut wood. Adding a layer of concern was his recent diagnosis with a terminal illness. Ultimately, we found him in his barn, suspended by the neck from a rafter. My partner, a seasoned deputy, had witnessed much in his time. For me, however, this was a stark and brutal introduction to the realities of the job. The scene was grim. He'd been there for a while, his neck elongated, his lower extremities congested with blood. My partner instructed me to support his thighs while he cut the rope. The moment the rope gave way, the man's body slumped heavily against me, the force expelling a long, guttural sound from his throat and voice box, a drawn-out moan unlike anything I had ever heard. The sound startled me so profoundly that I screamed and instinctively let go. He fell to the ground. A wave of guilt washed over me, a shared sorrow for both the deceased and his grieving wife. A recent call I responded to was pretty unsettling. I was assisting with a rescue call, and dispatch told us that the caller had returned home from the store to find her sister unconscious in her bed. When we arrived, it was clear that her sister was already deceased. What made the situation even creepier was that rescue had gotten there first, but they hadn't really looked around until we arrived. There were obvious signs of a break-in, like a broken window in the back room with shards of glass on the inside of the house. It also seemed like she might have been strangled. Rescue still transported her since she had some signs of life when they first arrived, but they said it must have happened within the last hour. I couldn't help but feel incredibly sorry for the sister who found her. I responded to a single vehicle crash out in the county. When we found the car, it had left the road, crashed through a fence, rolled at least 3 times, and finally came to rest upright. The driver was badly mangled, and the paramedic on scene declared him deceased. We secured the area and waited for the coroner to arrive. Once the coroner got there and confirmed the death, he began his investigation and documentation. About 20 minutes into this, we were all gathered near the coroner's van, discussing the situation about 20 feet away from the car. Suddenly, the driver, who hadn't been removed from the car yet, sat up, looked around, and started the engine. We all jumped about 5 feet in the air. It turned out the driver survived, and there was a major investigation into how 2 trained professionals could have mistakenly declared a living person dead. I'm a former police officer, and this particular incident was the catalyst for my decision to leave law enforcement. We were executing a no-knock search warrant at a suspected drug house. The protocol was clear. The first officer entering would secure the individual closest to the door, the second officer the next, and so on. As the fourth officer in, naturally, the suspect nearest to me decided to flee. I pursued him down a hallway as he bolted into a room, slamming the door behind him. I breached the door immediately after, tackling him and quickly getting him under control. Before I could cuff him, I noticed his hand was concealed beneath the bed. After escorting him to the living room where the other suspects were being detained, I returned to the room to investigate. There, under the bed, lay a double-barrel sawed-off shotgun. A cold dread washed over me. I documented the scene with photographs and carefully collected the weapon. Upon opening the barrels, I found them loaded with 2 slugs. While I can't say with certainty whether he intended to use it against me had he managed to grab it, the realization of how close I had come was enough to rob me of sleep for 2 consecutive nights. 3 weeks later, I submitted my resignation. This isn't my personal experience, but a story shared by the resource officer at my school. She was relatively new to the force in our city, about 3 months on the job, as I recall. She responded to a call regarding a domestic disturbance involving loud banging within an apartment building. Upon entering the building, she could clearly hear the commotion and followed the sound down the hallway. There, she encountered a man slowly and weakly swinging an axe at a door. Given his sluggish movements, she suspected he was under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Drawing her taser, she commanded him to drop the axe and get on the ground. The man looked up, then suddenly charged at her, sprinting with the axe raised. She deployed her taser, and he instantly stopped in his tracks, collapsing face first onto the floor, at which point he involuntarily urinated himself. This isn't my story. It was recounted to me by a friend whose boyfriend worked for emergency services. He received an urgent 000 call from a woman driving on the highway. Distraught, she reported witnessing someone hanging from the overpass above. She was certain the person was deceased. However, when the emergency responders arrived at the scene, they were met with a horrifying detail the caller had omitted in her shock. The deceased's body had become detached from his head, which remained caught in whatever he had used to hang himself. Tragically, his body had fallen onto the hood of the woman's car as she drove beneath the overpass. Yes, he was undeniably deceased. It was during a night shift. I was dispatched to a back street for an urgent call reporting a potential robbery in progress at a woman's house. The street was completely dark due to a blackout. Despite searching, I found no sign of any thieves. Just as I was about to leave the dimly lit street, a stray cat suddenly leaped out from behind a trash can and landed on me. For a terrifying moment, my entire body froze. My heart pounded in my chest. Never in all my time working had I experienced such a sudden and intense jolt of fear. My uncle served as a police officer in Los Angeles. He once responded to a severe single-vehicle accident. A car, speeding around a corner, had careened off the road and become wedged vertically between some concrete barriers. The vehicle was positioned upright, with the driver facing downwards and the trunk pointing skyward. The driver, though trapped by his legs due to the crushed front of the car, was still somewhat conscious. Tragically, before they could extricate him, the car caught fire. He was essentially burned alive within the wreckage. Once the flames were extinguished and the car was removed, all that remained of the driver was his skeletal remains, except for his legs, which were eerily preserved within the footwell. As a rookie officer, I once responded to a burglar alarm at a restaurant with a local reputation for being haunted by a woman. The first officer on the scene was an older, typically unflappable guy who rarely showed much urgency on the radio. So, when he arrived and immediately requested second unit in a surprisingly high-pitched voice, it definitely caught my attention. As I pulled up to the scene, I saw him with his shotgun drawn, leaning over the hood of his patrol car. My immediate thought was, oh no, someone's definitely breaking in. I rushed over to him, asking what was happening. Visibly shaken, all he could manage to say was that as he pulled up and his headlights illuminated the building, a woman had jumped off the roof and then vanished. Another officer and I thoroughly checked the entire building, but found absolutely no evidence of anyone having been there. The incident left a lasting impression on me, and I made it a point to never return to that restaurant at night without another officer present. During my time on patrol, my partner and I received a welfare check request for an elderly man whose family, living out of state, had been unable to reach him. These calls always carried a heavy weight, a sense of foreboding about what we might find behind closed door. The family had granted us permission to enter if there was no response, and there was none. The front door was locked, but we managed to open the garage and enter that way. The state of the garage offered a grim preview of what lay inside the house. It was crammed floor to ceiling, front to back, with accumulated junk, leaving only a narrow path to the interior door. Taking just a few steps into the garage, the overwhelming smell confirmed our grim expectations. Up to that point, the situation was more unsettling than outright scary. It wasn't my first encounter with a deceased individual. Navigating the narrow trails carved through the hoarded belongings in the living room and kitchen, we eventually reached the master bedroom. There, we found him seated in a rocking chair. Due to the advanced state of decomposition, his muscles no longer provided support. His upper body had slumped to the right, bent at an almost perfect 90-degree angle. His spine had snapped post-mortem, resulting in a disturbingly unnatural bend. It was profoundly eerie to witness a body contorted in such a way without any signs of trauma. His passing was later determined to be from natural causes. I wasn't a student police officer myself, but I was friends with many at my university. While there were countless pranks and typical college antics they shared, the one truly unsettling thing that came up repeatedly and independently across different individuals was what they called the Satanic Tunnel. Our university had several student-run churches, and apparently, the Catholic Church on campus had a tunnel system beneath it covered in satanic graffiti. Every student officer who mentioned it said they rarely, if ever, went back down there after their initial experience. A few years ago, a friend of my dad's was a police officer. One day, he was in pursuit of a suspect down a street. The individual ran into a burger restaurant and initially seemed to have gotten away. However, the suspect had actually circled back and ended up behind my dad's friend, pressing a gun to his head. He pulled the trigger, but fortunately, the weapon jammed and didn't fire. My dad's friend managed to subdue the suspect, but the experience understandably terrified him. Whether he resigned immediately after this incident or shortly thereafter, I can't recall with complete certainty, but he did eventually leave the police force. A relative of mine, who works as a police officer, shared a rather graphic story with me some time ago. It involved a young boy who had climbed a tree and unfortunately slipped. The fall resulted in a severe injury. His scrotum was split open, and his testicles were exposed and hanging out. My father was a police officer with the Metropolitan Police in London. For a significant part of his career, he was in the drug squad, a division of the Criminal Investigation Department, CID, that has likely been reorganized since then. His work often involved going undercover and interacting with some very unsavory individuals. I remember one occasion when I was pulled out of school by the police because his cover had been blown and our family received threats from members of a Colombian cartel. While I was quite young and don't recall all the specifics, I believe it was a precautionary measure, though my mother was understandably very worried. For those familiar with London's history, he was also one of the officers involved in the investigation into the tragic killing of PC Keith Blakelock during the Broadwater Farm riots in the 1980s. He had stories about that area, and from what I understand, it was a dangerous place to have to go. I'm not a police officer, but I heard this story from one while working on a mental health unit. It's by far the most bizarre case I've encountered. About 2 years ago, a man was admitted after calling the police to report an intruder in his apartment. When officers arrived, they found no sign of a break-in, but they did find a man extremely high. I don't remember which drug he was on. What they discovered inside was deeply disturbing. The apartment was strung with headless dolls, hung from barbed wire that crisscrossed the rooms. Some of the dolls had clearly been tampered with, and in the kitchen, a pot was boiling on the stove, filled with the dolls' heads. When the officers asked him to explain what was going on, all he said was, "I'm opening the seal." He was brought to our unit for evaluation. Strangely enough, during his stay, he was calm, cooperative, and entirely lucid. If I hadn't heard the story directly from the responding officers, I never would have guessed what he'd been involved in. Back when I was in the military police, I had just started my night shift. I was checking out my patrol car, making sure everything was ready, radar calibrated, gear squared away. It was the usual routine during shift change. Day patrols coming in, night patrols heading out. That's when dispatch came over the radio. They got a call about a man with a gun walking toward the main gate. I looked over at one of my partners who was standing next to his patrol car. We locked eyes and gave each other that unmistakable "oh shit" look. Without saying a word, we both jumped in our vehicles and floored it toward the gate. I must have hit 80 or 90 miles per hour. When I got there, I rolled down my window and asked one of the gate guards where the guy was. He pointed down the road, just outside the gate. Now, technically that stretch of road was still considered military property, even though it was outside the base, up until it hit a traffic light in the nearby town. So I took off in that direction, adrenaline pumping. At this point, I'm thinking worst case scenario. Active shooter. Fort Hood style situation. Maybe even a terrorist attack, especially considering that less than a year earlier, the FBI caught someone trying to sneak a bomb on a base. I spot a guy walking and swing my spotlight onto him. I see a glint of something metallic in his hand. That's it. I slam the brakes, throw it in park, jump out, draw my sidearm, and start shouting, "Let me see your hands. Hands up." And then I see what's actually in his hand. A thermos. Right then, my partner rolls up behind me. I've still got the guy at gunpoint while my partner approaches and pats him down, completely unarmed. Turns out, someone driving by saw the reflection off the thermos and mistook it for a weapon. That's what triggered the call. Since I had to do some paperwork on the guy, I told him to hop in my passenger seat to stay warm. It was a cold night. I kept apologizing over and over. Poor guy was probably terrified. Turns out he had a DUI on his record, which is why he was walking in the first place, and he worked as a janitor at one of the base schools. Looking back, it's kind of funny in a dark way. But at the time, it was one of the scariest moments of my life. I was fully convinced I was about to get into a gunfight. Got a call over the radio. All units respond to Maple Street. Report of a male with a rifle walking toward Maple Elementary. Thing is, I was already on Maple Street. Immediate adrenaline surge. My whole body tensed up in an instant. Turned out to be a guy walking with a closed umbrella slung over his shoulder. Then there was the time I responded to a 911 hang-up around 2 a.m. on a rainy morning. I walked up to the front door to check things out and knock. Before I could do anything, the homeowner opened the door, already standing there, shirtless, wearing a CPAP mask. I nearly jumped out of my skin. Another call took me to an abandoned mental hospital deep in the woods. Someone reported a trespasser. That place has a reputation. Teens like to sneak in to get spooked or tag the place. We didn't find anyone, but I'll tell you right now, I have zero desire to ever go back there, day or night. I've also been alone with people in their final moments after car accidents or shootings. It's not scary exactly, just surreal. Being the last person someone sees. That feeling sticks with you. I'm not a police officer, but my dad was. He once told me a story that still gives me chills. One night, around 1 a.m., he responded to a call about a suspicious person on someone's property. The address was in a remote, heavily wooded area, pretty isolated. When he arrived, he got out of his patrol car and started sweeping the area with his flashlight. The house on the property was 3 stories tall and in serious disrepair, but what stood out most was the number of windows. It was covered in them, far more than you'd expect. As he approached, a loud, deep voice suddenly shouted from the house, "Take one more step and I'll blow your head off." My dad tried to shine his flashlight toward the house, but the reflection off the countless windows made it impossible to see anything inside. Then another voice, calmer but still commanding, told him, "Put your hands up and the light down." He complied, but as he raised his hands, he managed to discreetly hit the emergency button on his radio. Now, my dad had a reputation in his department as someone who could handle just about anything solo. So when that panic signal went out, it sent a jolt through everyone. Officers from all over the area responded, expecting the worst. He stood there for what he said felt like 10 of the longest minutes of his life, not knowing if he was about to get shot, before backup finally arrived and surrounded the place. They went through the house thoroughly. All the doors were locked. There were no signs of forced entry, no movement, no evidence that anyone had even been there. To this day, he never got an explanation. And to this day, it still creeps me out every time I think about it. Having only been on the job for 3 months, I responded to a scene where a man had taken his own life with a shotgun. I recall entering the house and initially being puzzled by the small pieces of plastic scattered on the floor. As I rounded a corner, the horrifying reality came into view. The plastic fragments weren't plastic at all. They were chunks of flesh and muscle that had been expelled by the force of the gunshot. It became clear that his suicide was a deliberate act intended to traumatize his soon-to-be ex-wife. He had left a note and a bag of mail on the front porch, ensuring she would be the one to discover him. The most disturbing aspect of this tragedy was the timing. It was his stepdaughter's prom night. When I informed her of her stepfather's suicide, she cried briefly, then her expression hardened. Turning to me, her face devoid of emotion, she said, "He did this on purpose to hurt me." My dad's a police officer, and while he has no shortage of intense stories, he's never shared what he considers the scariest. He tends to keep those to himself. The only truly creepy story he's ever told me wasn't even directly related to police work. It was something that happened on the side. For context, my dad is a total skeptic when it comes to anything supernatural. Growing up, I wasn't allowed to watch ghost hunting shows, and anytime I brought up paranormal stuff, he shut it down fast. No nonsense, no superstition. So this stuck with me. There's a house in my hometown that's known, at least to locals, for a brutal murder that happened there back in the 1980s. One day, my dad's friend was considering buying the place and invited my dad to walk through it with him. Another woman, whose connection to them I don't quite remember, came along too. According to my dad, the moment they stepped inside, the woman froze. Her face went pale, and she just kept repeating, "Something awful happened here. We need to leave." My dad asked his friend if either of them knew about the murder that had taken place in the house. His friend vaguely remembered hearing about a case like that, but didn't realize it was that house. And the woman? She wasn't even from the area. There was no way she would have known the history. To this day, it's the only time my dad has ever acknowledged experiencing something he couldn't explain. And for someone who deals with real-world horror on a regular basis, I think the idea of something beyond that, something he can't control or rationalize, is a line he chooses not to cross. This is a story my husband, who works as a constable in the UK, told me. It was his first week back on duty after training, and he was on a back shift, meaning he should have been home around 2 a.m. When he didn't return that night, I naturally started to panic. I finally received a call at 10 a.m. the next morning from a very tired husband who was just finishing his paperwork. He explained that he had been called to a domestic violence incident at a block of flats. As he and his colleagues walked through the communal hallway towards the main door of the apartment, they passed blood-stained walls, a clear indication that someone had been forcibly dragged. Inside, they found the wife unconscious on the floor, her upper lip completely torn off. Her husband was sitting nearby, quite calmly, with a blood-covered baseball bat next to him, the scene awash with blood. We received a call concerning a woman who lived alone with her dogs and hadn't been seen for a while, raising concerns. My colleague and I forced entry into her home and were immediately met by her 3 dogs, who were clearly agitated. We began searching the property. In the living room, our attention was drawn to the couch, where an unusual object protruded upwards. Despite it being daytime with good visibility, I couldn't initially identify what it was. It resembled an arm sticking straight up. After circling a couple of times, the horrifying truth dawned on me. It was the spine of the resident, whose body had been partially consumed. Most of her midsection was gone, with only a strip of skin connecting her legs to her upper torso. Her legs had been dragged towards her head, causing her spine to jut vertically from the remains. The scene was gruesome. We conducted our initial inquiries, and the dogs were removed from the property, as were the human remains. Despite the horrific nature of the discovery, there were no apparent suspicious circumstances, and it was treated as a sudden death. Arrangements were made for a cleaning crew. We had just left the scene when we realized we hadn't located the pelvis. Not wanting the cleaning crew to find it, we returned and conducted another search. Despite our efforts, there was still no sign of it. It became chillingly apparent that the dogs must have completely consumed the entire pelvis. I'm not a police officer, but I work as a crime scene investigator for the police department. I was on the 3rd shift, monitoring our call queue, where we can see all incoming calls. I noticed a call detailing a woman who had arrived at the hospital claiming she'd been held captive for days, sexually assaulted and beaten, and that her parents had been murdered. Initially, some of my fellow investigators suspected she might be a 10 to 73, our code for someone experiencing mental health issues or instability. There is a bit of a dismissive, "oh, okay, crazy lady" reaction, a coping mechanism, as our job can be tough, and humor sometimes helps us get through it. However, we switched to the channel covering the division where she gave her address, and an officer was dispatched to conduct a welfare check at the residence to verify her story. It turned out she was telling the horrifying truth. The officer observed blood seeping from the garage. Inside the house, her mother was found upstairs, bound and deceased. There was also a bedroom containing cables, chains, and other restraints that had clearly been used to hold the woman captive. Further investigation revealed that her father had also been murdered and placed in the trunk of her car. Tragically, she hadn't realized her father's body was in the trunk when she drove herself to the hospital. Having seen my share of crime scenes, there was something profoundly disturbing about walking into that house. It had an undeniable atmosphere, a palpable sense that truly awful things had occurred within those walls. I'm not a police officer, but I once did a ride-along with a friend who is. We responded to a possible suicide call based on a strong odor emanating from an apartment and a significant accumulation of mail. We forced entry into the apartment. Inside, we found a man who had died by suicide using a shotgun. He had apparently held the weapon straight out, and upon falling forward, the barrel had become lodged in his head through the gunshot wound. Protocol dictated that a body couldn't be transported to the morgue with a weapon still embedded. As a result, several police officers had the grim task of stabilizing the man's head, while another officer carefully extracted the shotgun. Compounding the horror was the fact that the man had been deceased and decomposing for 3 days. The scene in that room was profoundly disturbing and something and I'm sure everyone present, will never forget. This happened to my dad, who was a road patrol officer about 2 years ago. He was on duty when he heard an engine accelerating rapidly behind him. Before he could fully react, a man in a pickup truck slammed into the back of his patrol car. Initially, my dad radioed it in as a likely accident. However, the truck then reversed and hit his car again. It became clear to my dad that this was intentional. As the truck tried to drive off, my dad maneuvered his patrol car, turning it into the path of the truck as it passed, effectively disabling it. My dad tried to get out of his car, but found he couldn't move his leg. Despite this, he kept his focus on the other driver, ordering him to keep his hands visible. The man in the truck began hitting himself in the face, repeatedly shouting, "Kill me, kill me. I'm going to kill you." My dad hadn't seen any weapons and the man remained in his vehicle, so he maintained his vigilance until backup units arrived. They arrested the man, and my dad was taken to the hospital. When I arrived at the hospital, my dad told me he had been terrified because he couldn't feel or move his leg. He was worried he might never walk again. Thankfully, there was no permanent damage, and after some physical therapy, he regained most of the feeling and his ability to walk. During their subsequent interview with the man who rammed my dad's car, he stated that he had no regrets. He had wanted to die and had intended to provoke the police into shooting him, death by cop. He even said something about wanting to kill my dad in the crash to enrage the other officers. So yeah, that's definitely our family's scariest story. I'm a teacher, and I had a police officer visit my grade 12 class to talk about careers in law enforcement. One of my students asked him a question that prompted him to share a particularly disturbing story. He recounted a time when he responded to a welfare check. A neighbor had called, concerned because she babysat 2 young boys daily, and their father hadn't been answering his phone or the door. The officer entered the home through the front door and was confronted with a horrific scene in the living room. The man had hanged himself from a rafter. Tragically, his 2 small children were there, playing with his feet as his body swung. The officer explained that the man had taken his own life 2 days prior. He described the situation as both incredibly creepy and deeply sad, especially the image of the 2 young boys innocently amusing themselves with their father's lifeless body. During a riot, my father, who was a police officer, discharged his weapon and struck a young child. The child had been holding what appeared to be an assault rifle. In the chaos that followed as the crowd dispersed, others were able to reach the child to offer assistance, only to find that he had already died. The assault rifle was a toy. This tragic incident deeply traumatized my father. He was never the same afterward, carrying the weight of that decision. Even now, years later, he struggles with alcohol, nightmares, and panic attacks stemming from his time in the police force. My cousin, who works as an EMT in a large city, shared this unusual story. Dealing with overdoses and drug-related incidents often means encountering individuals who are resistant to involving the police. On one particular call, they were dispatched to an apartment for a suspected overdose. However, upon arrival, someone inside who was opposed to contacting law enforcement or emergency services brandished a crossbow and threatened them, telling them not to enter. My cousin didn't elaborate on how the situation was ultimately resolved, but it certainly made for a memorable story. I worked for a private ambulance service in South Africa for 5 years, and I have a few stories that stand out. One particularly creepy incident involved a call for a child in cardiac arrest. As always with pediatric emergencies, we rushed to the scene. We entered the house to find the mother sitting on the bed beside her seemingly lifeless child. We asked the mother to move so we could assess the child. As I took hold of the child's feet to move her onto the floor for CPR, she suddenly woke up. Apparently, she had just been asleep. The mother's casual comment was, "Oh, I thought she was dead." Beyond the unsettling calls, there were genuinely scary moments. I experienced gunshots erupting around me, had rocks thrown at my ambulance, and witnessed a colleague's suicide attempt. Another time, a colleague phoned to say she was being held hostage at a residence we had initially been dispatched to, but she was trying to handle the call herself. The list of intense and frightening experiences goes on. When I was 13, I was in a horrible car accident. There's 7 kids in my family, and we were just coming back from church. My mom was driving, my grandma was in the passenger seat, my aunt and 3 older siblings were in the second row. I'm the middle child, and the rest of us were packed in the back. If you're wondering, yes, there were way too many people in the car, so none of us had seatbelts on. It would have been too uncomfortable. Then, out of nowhere, boom, we were hit from the left. The next thing I remember was the smell of hot concrete, smoke, and blood. I somehow fell out of the window as the car was flipping over. I ended up on the ground, looking up at the car, completely upside down. Everyone managed to crawl out, but we were all injured. People nearby saw the wreck and called 911, and we were all rushed to the hospital. I hear about families of 3 who were all wearing seatbelts and still didn't survive crashes. It makes me wonder, how the hell am I still alive? I've got some scars, but that's really it. We're all fine now, living like nothing ever happened, but honestly, it still scares the hell out of me. The father of one of my classmates is a police officer. During his time on active patrol, he's now in an office role. My apologies if my terminology isn't precise. He received a call shortly after finishing his pizza. The call concerned a man who hadn't been in contact with his family for more than a week. He went to the man's residence, forced the door open with the concerned family member, stepped inside, immediately turned around, and exited. The scene inside was grim. The man had been deceased for a significant period. His jaw had detached and rested on his lap, and his body was in a state of decomposition. The truly unsettling part, the cherry on the cake as my classmate put it, was the information from the morgue. The man had been dead for over a week. However, his family had called him just 6 days prior, and someone had answered the phone. That last detail is what really creeped me out. If you made it to the end of the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, and we will see you in the next video.